Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Tom Leppert joins us for the second half of our show, the CEO of Kaplan, Inc. Kaplan was formerly part of the Washington Post company, generating the bulk of its profits before the Post was sold off to Jeff Bezos. Tom, welcome to the show.
It's good to be with you.
Tom, just about anyone whose kids has taken the SAT is familiar with Kaplan test prep, but fewer people know about Kaplan Higher Education. Tell us a bit about Kaplan University.
Exactly. I think Kaplan is a brand that's known to a lot of folks, but as you said, it's usually through our test prep, which is actually only about 10 or 15% of our company. The largest piece of it is our higher education. That is largely an online, not totally, but largely an online institution that handles associate degrees, bachelor's degrees, and all the way up in some areas to doctorate degrees too. Those students, for the most part, though, are what the Department of Education would call high-risk students. They have risk factors that are different than what you would associate with traditional colleges and universities. So instead of students at kind of the 18 to 24 age group, which would comprise about 80% of the population at traditional school, at Kaplan, only 5% of our students would fall into that. In other words, 95% of our students would be older than 24 years old. They would also tend to be lower income, and in a lot of cases, they are single parents, and they really have been out in the workforce, and they're using their college education to improve their career prospects going forward.
So these are strivers. No one in your schools is born with a silver spoon.
None of those. It tends to be, as I said, a lower income student, and a student that's probably been out of the educational world for a period of time.
Now, I'm on your website right now, and I don't see a lot of drama and gender studies. I see fire science, nursing, teacher education. All of this stuff it's like it's very much career-oriented.
It's very career-oriented, and I would argue that for the most part, this is what makes our economy work. It's these types of jobs, and it's clearly the students that we serve.
I see that students get the first 3 weeks free to give it a try. That's pretty interesting. I can't imagine going to Princeton for 3 weeks and then deciding whether I want to stay. How does that work?
I don't think that happens. It's called the Kaplan Commitment. It is a unique program, and it was put in place as a way to give students a chance to see if this is the right environment for them. And as you said, they come for several weeks, and if it's not right for them, there's no money out. They leave without any debt, without any payments. It's a program that has been very successful for us. It's an expensive program, but it's been a program that's been very successful for us because it allows the student to make the determination, is this the right thing for them? And that's what we want. I think one of the great things about Kaplan is it really does put the student first. We want to make sure that the sort of things that we're doing really serve the student and give them opportunities in their life.
And it's both online, and is there a campus and a day or night program? What does that look like?
We have campuses, but the large proportion of the work that we do is online. Because again, unlike a traditional school, it's a much more flexible environment, which you have to have with the students that we serve. In a lot of cases that are working, they have families, so they need a much more flexible environment. And that's what we've done. Our sector, the career colleges, otherwise known as for-profits, tends to be a much more flexible environment, which caters to the needs of these individual higher-risk students.
So these are people who are working all day and then come home and hit the books.
Exactly. Yeah. In a lot of cases, that's exactly what happens. And we know how to deal with these students. At Kaplan, our graduation rate for students with more than one risk factor, so instance, older than the typical age of 24, file taxes and independent, have dependents, single parent, jobs, those sorts of things. For those students, our graduation rates are with more than one risk factor, or twice what the national average is.
Interesting. You never hear that in the press. The for-profits or the career colleges have been on the receiving end of a lot of criticism. It's different when you look into the numbers.
It is, and it's unfortunate. In too many cases, there's numbers thrown around that are just fallacious. It's good through this debate that a lot of those numbers, one that was used a number of different times, that attempted to show that career colleges were producing incomes that were less than for high school graduates, that the career colleges were lower, and that simply was not right. In fact, at Kaplan, our students, our graduates leave with incomes that are 40 to 50% larger than when they started the program. It's exactly what we want to accomplish.
Well, it's funny. My dad worked in a machine shop all day and went to engineering school at night and took a pay cut when he took his first engineering job because he was doing pretty well in the machine shop. But it worked out for him in the long run.
Well, and as you point out too, and I think we'll get into it in a little bit more detail when we talk about some of the regulations that are being proposed. What a college education does, it gives you opportunities not just in the first year, but over a course of a period of time. So you want to measure the effect of that over one's life. And as you pointed out with your dad, and I would say is the general rule is that a college education and education of any kind, be it an associate degree, a bachelor's degree, or beyond that, makes a real difference in life. I can tell you, as having been a mayor of a very large metropolitan city, that a diploma solves an awful lot of problems. If we can educate people, it gives them opportunities, and that's what we try to do.
And we've heard a lot about the cost of supporting students both in traditional and career colleges. I'm looking at some numbers here because until I read this, I thought just the opposite. The not-for-profit schools and four-year public institutions, when you add it all up, the Pell Grants, and all the support, it looks like they're taking in almost twice per student what the career colleges are.
Yeah, and you can look at it in terms of the debt of individual students too. The average graduate of a Kaplan bachelor's degree student would leave with about $27,500 worth of debt. Compare that to public institutions. Iowa State University graduates have an average of about a little bit over $30,000, so 10% more in debt. And that doesn't take into consideration that Iowa State or public institutions receive hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies, which of course Kaplan doesn't.
And yet, if you look at across higher education, graduation rates are abysmal. I mean, if you look at full-time four-year colleges, something like 40% of the students don't graduate in 6 years. And in fact, almost three-quarters of the students in community colleges don't graduate in 3 years. The statistics, I think, for career colleges are similar. What do you attribute that to?
Well, again, I think it's important to look at the different type of students. Clearly, a higher risk student has a lower graduation rate. If you're coming out of a high income environment and you're going to an Ivy League, that's going to have a higher graduation rate. Again, less challenges that are attached to it. The career colleges focus on those students that we talked about that have higher risk factors. And they run into a lot of challenges in life. In some cases, the job that they're at, they lose that. There could be family situations, those sorts of things. We're very proud of the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, Kaplan students graduate at a rate that's almost 2 times what the national average is for those high-risk students.
So student debt is in the news. The federal government has crossed the $1 trillion mark in terms of student loans outstanding. They've pretty much driven the private sector out of the business, so most of these are guaranteed by the government.
That's correct.
And default rates are going through the roof, and it's starting to frighten a lot of people. There are a bunch of solutions that have come before Congress, and some of them seem targeted specifically at the career college sector. Maybe you can bring us up to date on that.
Well, what's being proposed is what they call gainful employment regulation. And it would fundamentally look at each program against 2 factors. One factor is a debt-to-earnings ratio, and then the second factor would be a default. Unfortunately, the effect of these regulations is going to be exactly what should not be the case, and that's to deny access to students, in a lot of cases, the students that most need it.
But let's pause a minute. Debt to what earnings? How are the earnings measured?
Well, that's one of the problems. The earnings would be measured by the Social Security Administration or another unidentified federal body. So it would be numbers that unfortunately are subject to a lot of error. And it could very well put a program out of business and deny access to students, even though it was poor numbers. Importantly, too, it's based on the very early years. As you and I talked about a moment ago, education makes a difference over the course of one's life. So it's measured only very early. It's measured numbers that the schools don't control and, in fact, can't even check the accuracy on. So it's a real problem with it.
And is this by degree or by school?
It's actually by program within the school.
Program within the school.
Individual programs. And as you point out, it's targeted just at the career colleges or the for-profit.
Well, wait a minute. You mean it's not across the board to all people that are taking student loans?
It's not. It only attacks one segment of it, the career colleges. And in fact, that's fundamentally unfair when we think of governmental regulation. If we've got a problem, and we acknowledge that there's a problem, we work hard on that every single day to try to address it, it ought to apply to all schools across the board. to give you a feel if this applied to all programs across the board, just taking the debt to earnings, private nonprofits wouldn't qualify, and private public institutions wouldn't qualify too. Large programs, as an example, at Northwestern University, their journalism program wouldn't qualify. Most law programs, people going to law school, those programs wouldn't qualify either if it applied to them.
How does that work? Because if you're going on to a higher education, are they counting your income while you're in graduate school or in law school?
No, they're counting the first or second year out of it. And of course, if you come out of law school, there's a lot of debt attached to that. So if this regulation applied to a lot of law schools, to law schools across the board, a lot of those programs simply wouldn't qualify. That shows the unfairness of the regulation itself.
Well, it would certainly wipe out art history majors, I would think.
Yeah, it's going to pull out an awful lot of those programs. In fact, if you looked at, and very well thought of institutions, such as the University of Texas, 24 of their programs wouldn't qualify. Programs in English, programs in women's studies, programs in Russian studies. Those programs wouldn't qualify if the regulation applied across the board. But unfortunately, it doesn't. It targets only one sector of it. You mentioned earlier, too, the default rates. If you look at Kaplan University, our graduates are meeting their loan obligations in 94% of the cases. So it's really unfortunate. What this regulation would do is deny access to students that need it most, in the case of the low-income, higher-risk students. And it's simply not fair. It doesn't apply across the board.
I'm sorry, that almost passed me by. Are you saying that Kaplan graduates only have a 6% default rate?
Their graduates only have 6% default rate. That's exactly right.
That's a fantastic number. What's the problem?
Well, unfortunately, again, as we talked about earlier, public policy sometimes doesn't focus on the numbers and the facts. It becomes much more subjective than that.
Who's gunning for you guys?
Well, it's unfortunate. This regulation, as we talked about, only applies to one sector. If we've got an issue out there, and we clearly believe that there's a lot of issues in terms of education that need to be dealt with, we're very supportive of regulations. We would simply just like to see it take into consideration the different types of students. Again, we don't serve the Ivy League students. We serve students that are higher risk. Take that into consideration, the different challenges that each of those student groups have, and make it apply to everybody. Make it apply across the board. That's the way regulation should be. And I think, one of the fundamental tenets of our country is a sense of fairness, treating everybody equally.
Let me put you on the spot and make you the czar of federal student loans and ask you some specifics about how you would design a program that would have the characteristic of fairness, so it's applied across the board, that would weed out inappropriate borrowers, maybe early on, and I don't know what that would look like. I'm going to ask you to answer that question. And that would have a feedback mechanism, so poorly performing programs or degrees that didn't lead to gainful employment, you'd slowly start dialing down the amount of money available to those areas, and areas where it was producing very successful graduates, you'd dial the money up. How would you design that?
I would design it, first of all, by starting with the principles that says we in this country have a real challenge. Higher education has increased at rates that simply are not sustainable, and unfortunately with it has followed debt. So to address that, first of all, we want to address all institutions and treat them across the board.
Level playing field.
Level playing field.
Okay.
So let's come up with some metrics that apply across the board that are going to take the outliers, the ones that are truly the problems, and focus on those. And then the second is, let's risk adjust it. Let's not kid ourselves that a student that walks into an Ivy League school has the same challenges that a single mother that may be 28 or older and is supporting families, got another job, and is trying to go to school online to give her some new opportunities. Let's not treat those students separately. Let's risk adjust it so that we're addressing the needs of the students.
But with such a smaller default rate, why is it, again, that doesn't factor in? I mean, if they're paying back their money, they're paying back their money.
Again, I think one of the challenges with the career schools is because of the students that we serve, our graduate rates are much lower than the Ivy League schools. But again, it's because of the students that we serve. Again, in the hypothetical regulations that we're talking about, take that into consideration. Take the outliers and eliminate those. We'd be very supportive of that.
Are there areas that you think, in general, you might want to dial back on because of how changing market conditions, or that the graduates just are not in that high a demand?
Well, I think you need to be careful in the metrics that you use. And again, let's take another example of the metric that's on the table that is using this debt to earnings piece. Well, in this situation, again, as we said, it only applies to one sector, which is fundamentally unfair. Mm. But you also have it that it's not taking into consideration the changes in the economy over time. Debt to earnings at times when we've got economic challenges, we're in recession, those are going to be lower. Those programs go away, and with them will go access even when you come up to the economic times. So this regulation doesn't take into consideration changes in the economy at all.
Most regulations don't.
They don't, and it's unfortunate. But the reality of it is you and I and the people in our nation have to take that into consideration.
So Kaplan was once part of the Washington Post company. Of course, we all know that the Washington Post was sold quite recently, and the shareholders have retained ownership of Kaplan. You went through some tough times after the economy contracted. How are you doing now?
We're real optimistic. 2013 was a significantly improved year, and I would tell you everybody at Kaplan is very enthusiastic. We spend a lot of time thinking about our student and our individual student needs, and we're very optimistic about what we do. As we talked about earlier, we're very proud of what we do. We've talked about the graduation rates, which was twice the national average. We see our students, our graduates, when they leave, are getting substantial increases in salary. So we're excited about those sorts of things. We think that there's an awful lot of potential. As a business, we've got a strong presence in higher education in the United States and internationally. We've got the test prep, which is the leader in that field. Mm-hmm. We have a burgeoning business-to-business business, which is allowing us to get into new sectors. We're also involved in vocational training, one of the large English language businesses, and we work with international students to provide them opportunities, especially students coming out of areas in Asia and Africa that have had less educational opportunities. So, you look across the globe, we see ourselves as a global company, and we're excited about what we can bring to bear.
What does the revenue flow look like in terms of dependency on government sources? I know it was very high at one point. I would imagine you're trying to diversify away from that given the political pressure.
We are. And clearly a regulation like this makes it more difficult. That's why I said one of the real issues, it doesn't have anything to do with Kaplan, but it will force companies like Kaplan and others to move away from providing access to the students that most need it. Again, we think the focus ought to be the students. And when regulations make it more difficult to provide the type of programs that have been successful, then all of a sudden it's the student that gets hurt.
Have you thought at all about collaboration with traditional colleges using the work that you've done and the infrastructure you've built with online education?
We actually do quite a bit of that. We offer online programs where we work with other institutions in the United States, traditional institutions, and then we work with public institutions and private nonprofit institutions all across the globe, bringing students to them and working with them collectively on different programs.
Your students certainly come from disadvantaged areas, which generally means they've come from underperforming public high schools. Have you thought at all about poking down into the high school level?
We do a very little bit of what you call K through 12. Our focus has really been on higher education and lifelong learning. That's where we've put our resources, and that's where we think that we can do the best job. So we would focus going forward on kind of higher education and beyond.
And let the charter school folks worry about the K through 12.
Yes.
Do you find that it's somewhat of a burden and a stigma that you're running a business that has to make a profit?
I think if you look at for-profit not only in education, but you look at it, across the board, you see that delivers a lot of benefits, both to society and individual customers. I think that the for-profit is really a source of innovation. First online institutions were for-profits. They were the ones that really innovated in a way that made it much more flexible for people to access education and also made it much cheaper. I think the other thing that you see when you look across the education market is you see that the for-profits, the career colleges, were the ones that step in to meet the needs of the higher risk student. Clearly the higher risk students' needs were not being met by traditional institutions. It was that market opportunity that came in that was filled by the for-profits. So when you look at innovation, when you look at meeting the needs, it's really the career colleges that have stepped up to the table. And that's why we are so concerned about this regulation, because it starts providing access and targets a sector that's provided innovation, that's met student needs, that's important to everybody.
Do you think there are enough success stories being told about your graduates?
There aren't, unfortunately. Again, I think we've touched on a little bit that there's some real myths out there. In fact, proprietary schools have much higher completion rates for students that are deemed to be at risk. So I think while the perception may be that the career colleges have a performance record less than the traditional, when you look at the students we serve, that's not simply right. We do a much better job with completion rates, with graduation rates, than traditional schools do. Part of it is getting that message out, and that's what we hope we can continue to do.
So, Tom, you've been in the construction business. You've been mayor of Dallas. You've stepped up now to run Kaplan. Where do you see yourself going over time?
I've been very fortunate. I had a chance to, as you point out, run companies in a lot of different sectors. I had the privilege of serving as the elected mayor of Dallas, and it was really those experiences that got me excited about education and what we could do, and the Kaplan was the terrific opportunity for that. We've talked about it. We serve students where we can really make a difference. I think that's what sets Kaplan apart. Our people clearly view what we do as a ministry. We can do something that's different than a lot of industries. I've been in a lot of industries. Those industries are all important. They make contributions to the economy. But when you think about education, if we touch a student, if we do a good job with that student, we're giving them chances to change their lives. And I think that's what's exciting, and that's why I'm in education. I saw it on the private side, but I also saw it on the public side as mayor. I went places in my city where elected officials didn't go. And I can tell you, with all the different programs that are out there, if we can educate people, if we can improve the percentage of folks that go to college, that graduate from it, that really makes a difference for our economy, for our society, but most of all, for those individual students. A diploma makes a real difference, and that's why I'm excited about what I do now. I've had a lot of chances to do a lot of different things, but in education, the people at Kaplan can make a real difference, and I hope I can help them do that.
Well, Tom, thanks for being on the show. Thanks for sharing the other side of this story, and good luck to you in the fight ahead.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much for having me.
That was Tom Leppert, CEO of Kaplan Inc., wrapping up this week's Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Drop me a line at bill@realclearradio.org, and look for us Saturdays at 10 a.m. and again at 6 here on Bloomberg Boston. See you next week.